Mr. H here. Yes, I escaped the clutches of authoritarian perdition, but that doesn't mean the hounds are off their hunt. When you have all I can relate, you will be their next target, perhaps earlier. They do not want you to know what I have to convey. So let's get down to breaking the law. His name, Lencho Onyilagu. Age, 42. A general in his political party's employ. He was a faithful and zealous servant of tyranny and terror. Location, Umgalpa Ngai, Africa. Date, 1985. This case file doesn't start in Africa, in the newly formed People's Republic of Umgalpa Ngai. Yes, Umgalpa Ngai. You in the West would never have heard of it. In the political and social upheaval of Africa during the 1980s, a small portion of Ethiopia had been severed from the main and formed its own diminutive nation. The West covered it up, already embarrassed over the events and bumblings of that era when governments starved and bled their inhabitants to perdition over fears of rebellion. Umgalpa Ngai was short-lived itself, but what a nightmare of slaughter it was, as the breakaway nation found itself constantly attempting to stop instability and rebellion until the military was essentially determined to murder everyone. All in the name of the people, naturally. Enough! That was where our story takes place, but to understand it we have to go to America, to the heartland, the Rust Belt, Indianapolis, Indiana, and there into one of those pesky churches that strove to aid and relieve their African brothers and sisters struggling to survive the endless pogroms. Life in the USA was good for the congregation of the Bleeding Heart of the Immaculate Son, a self-styled Christian congregation led by the founder and pastor. Life was very good indeed, horribly good. It was Sunday, and they all came to praise God and beg him for intervention in Africa's accursed affairs. The congregation was huge. And when I say huge, it wasn't all that plentiful, but the pews were stuffed. The members were all grotesquely fat, triple-sized. They pushed and squeezed into their seats, bulging and nudging to find a place to do worship. Elbows poked and pushed as if cow prods for those porkers. Each and every one, even the babies, were immense beyond compare. Large, white, sweaty bodies, pale and stuffed into obscenely tight clothes. Yes, life was that good to these people of the Bleeding Heart of the Immaculate Son. And they prayed and chanted, and by the lead of their pastor screamed and begged, and pleaded and began to cry and tantrum in their desires for divine intervention. Words don't even do this bunch justice. You would have to have seen to believe it. They had thrown copious dollars into baskets and boxes as they entered to donate to African aid, but now they wanted action and demanded it from their glorious and miraculous God. But he stayed his hand. He was silent to their pleas. Across thousands of miles of land and water, their conjoined church, a Catholic hovel in a desert area of Umgalpa Ngai, was following the motions of their American counterparts. Slowly, struggling to find their last reserves of energy, despite months of starvation, Stray Ngai approached the church doors. Dust swirled about, flies in their myriad swarmed the emaciated people, struggling to find solace in the arms of God, through his Son Jesus, and with all the help of all the saints above. The demons were strong in their land, and they had nothing but hope in their distended bellies. When pews were full, if you would say it so, there were arms' lengths between each and every person. It was a barren group of sweaty, dark-skinned natives, all on death's door, and pleading for relief in the afterlife they knew would be their immediate future. Outside, up in the hills near that Catholic church, lay all the evils of the land. As is typical to any despotic regime, the military had cloistered itself tightly within halls of opulence, and grew quickly paranoid and hateful of the lowly commoners demanding rights and freedoms to live their lives as efficiently as possible. To the rulers and their mastiff soldiers, ideas of rights and freedoms were dog whistles for rebellion and liberties to foster coups, and worse, lower taxes feeding the rich, fat bastards at the top of their country's food chain. And this is where we finally meet Lencho Onilagwu. He was the prize general of Leader Tasifa and the People's Party of the Republic. And on that day, he was personally held responsible for getting to the bottom of a deep well of insidious rebellion, obviously festering in Umgolpangai. This particular region had been contained on command of the People's Party itself. People that tried to enter or leave were first cowed to return to the area, or shot dead and buried on the sides of the road. And yet, despite stopping the movement of goods and supplies and stopping land from being irrigated, this specific place was able to survive. Someone, somehow, was smuggling food into the area, and Lencho Onilagwu knew it must have been connected to the church he was surveilling. The zealous general always held true to his leader's belief and directives. He thought back to what Leader Tasifa told him earlier in the week. The true reason these religious people were the ultimate terror of the land. It was in Tasifa's marble-lined office on the 3rd floor of the People's Palace in the capital. "Do you fathom, Lencho Onilagwu?" Leader Tasifa asked. "What these dirty and perfidious Christians are doing to us in Umgolpangai? Do you, dear Lencho Onilagwu?" The general silently shook his head while at attention before the desk of dear Leader. "Christians do something no one else do," Tasifa continued. "They obey the law of their God, the law of the Father of Christ. They weaken our morale in this glorious and free land by putting their fictitious God above the real state. And if we are to be united peoples, a new super race of Africans to rule all in time, we must be whole, we must be one, and we must be a law unto this world. Umgolpa must be resolute and in lockstep with the dictates of the wisdom and love of the People's Party. The state shall not be beholden to gods or any sort. We are above such fantasies. We are superior to these superstitions that have kept our people and our race down and in the mud for so long. And you, Lencho Onilagwu, will be a true hero in history of this republic and the world when we are victorious over the weak and the retrograde." On that hill, behind the general, were legions of men waiting with rifles drawn. The army of Umgolpangai would make a decisive move when given a signal, a nod from the general. Their problem would be ended today. Another church would be convicted by their own actions, and when the locals would come out food in hand, or other items restricted by the leader, Everyone would be riddled with lead and left to rot. The bodies rightfully left to be buzzard-feed in the harsh sun that Sunday. General Onilagwu grew steadily more anxious and slowly more annoyed. These weird Christians weren't coming out soon enough. The Mass was boring and long, he thought. Inside the church, the thin and weary parishioners swayed like wheat in the wind. Their voices groaned and croaked like old wood in a gentle storm. Many were crying in their desperation for resolve. The priest cried out to the beneficent one above, pleading for an end to their suffering in this awful world. God would indeed bring them cessation, because outside were the legions of destruction and division, waiting to bring conclusion to this story. And their general was finally fed up with the dawdling targets hidden within that chapel. "Enough!" Major Lencho Onilagwu told his subordinates. "This is ridiculous. Why are we even waiting? We are the state. We are the power of the people. We wait for no one. This ends now." He stood up, took a primed rifle from a soldier nearby, and went over the hill alone. "I shall drive them out," the major told his men. "There is no need for incrimination. They need only die. But why waste ammo riddling walls? I will go in and drive them all out like the sheep they are. And when they emerge, shoot! Shoot them all! Don't stop until they are all dead. I command you. Or I command you to stop." He trotted down to the church door and went inside, slowly, making sure no one was baiting him with a trap. "Our general is so brave," a corporal said. "He is indeed a true leader." "That is why we follow him," another soldier said. "He is with us. We are not his pawns, but his brothers." As the general silently slid into the church, he was shocked to hear their growing cries and choral howls of the starved people inside. Their voices grew. Light was emitting from behind the priest at the altar, as if they were using some mirrors to focus sunlight outside and create a show for the people in the pews. All the thin, reedy bodies shook and wobbled about, clacking like bags of bones. A sense of deep awe and fear gripped the general deep in his heart. The air was changing. Something odd was going on. And at that moment, a shofar was lifted onto high, blown by the lips of one up front near the altar. A deep and booming blast was sent reverberating through the place of worship, and it began to magnify with inhuman force. Something was wrong. There was power in that room. A power the general couldn't comprehend, because he had never beheld or been present to such might. Hand in hand with all the sensory experience, he felt hot and sweaty and uncomfortably distended. However, he ignored his own discomfort, because he was caught in a moment of fascination as he stared at the backs of the quivering people. They were blurring. Thin and unhealthy forms were shaking so vividly that they were contorting, blurring, throwing off drops of sweat and saliva. Something so perverse seemed to be happening that the general felt fear. As he concentrated on his observation, he noticed the faithful were getting thicker, wider, plumper. They were quickly growing fat. And beyond fat, obese. The voices in that church went from willowy and tortured to deep, strong, mature, and confident. Piccolos became thundering baritones. The structure shook with a sonic wave, pummeling the rafters and planks, creating a lackluster home for worship. Air became dense with heat and moisture. Suddenly, pain. The general dropped his rifle. He was being cut in half. His belt was so tight it was killing him. Taking off his belt, he next focused on getting off his pants and jacket. Like these poor people before him, he was bloating outward like an inflating balloon, his body becoming plump and unbelievably fat within a mere minute. His breathing was labored, his heart was taxed, and on top of that, his fright was causing him to lose control of his own bodily functions. Lencho Onilagwu knew he had to act now. The hapless general attempted to pick up his rifle, but his hands were so thick and unwieldy, they didn't even fit into the trigger guard. His firearms were rendered useless. He turned in panic. In the room of the church, everything settled. The light faded, and the people sighed in relief, cried in joy, and in their hearts was the praise of selfless adoration for their savior. Onilagwu, nearly naked, lurched through the front doors. His boots were so tight and his legs scraping thigh on thigh so painfully that he struggled to get anywhere. Emerging into the midday sun, he was surprised by the sound of thunder. A shot had peeled into the air. The general was struck by a bullet, and then another, and another. As he collapsed onto his knees, he cried out to his awaiting troops, "Stop!" "Wait!" cried the second in command, causing the troops to stand down. "That is the general!" No one could believe the revelation. They all came over the ridge and looked down, moving toward the lone, bloated body outside the church. But it was true! The grotesquely bulging form was indeed the general. It had on the general's army-issue boots with emblems of the People's Republic high up on the sides. Shreds of military cloth were still about parts of the fallen man's anatomy. Heaving his final breaths, the general believed he was saved. None of the bullets from his men had entered vital organs, most in the mounds of blubber around his limbs and torso. He knew he would survive that day, until he looked up at his men, grasping out with an inflated paw, and had a heart attack that ended him instantly. The men stood down at the general's orders. Their campaign was ended. Back in Indianapolis, the parishioners of the American Church, the bleeding heart of the Immaculate Son, their cries and wails and pleading and moaning died out in tired and creaking whispers of withered joy. Their job was done. They were in adulation of the Lord for his intervention in the affairs of the evil ones so far away. Staring at each other in great triumph were the emaciated, starved forms of sweaty, pale people draped in gigantic folds of clothing. Their shoes wobbled on their feet, their belts all being tightened several feet, using scarves or other devices to tie themselves together. And when they were all done, they saw a great gap between each of them. The pews weren't filled at all. It was a rather thin congregation, if you pardon the pun. They shuffled through the pews and out into the aisles, leaving their house of worship together as one. Some mild chatting was heard between the giggles and whispers of astonishment, and when outside, one of the elder leaders of the congregation turned to the flock and clapped loudly. "Now then," he bellowed with a higher voice than previous, "who's for a good brunch? Take your pick. Choose. Let us dine together." All the folks shuffled off together down the pike. Stretching before them were endless buildings and signs, each promoting a restaurant filled with the richest, most fattening foods the earth could provide. The people of the Bleeding Heart were off to do their duty once again, and within such duty, a kind of sinful enjoyment, to bring charity to others in need, about the corners of this odd and mysterious world we call Earth.
Like and subscribe before I die! And ring the little bell or you will surely go to hell.
Oh, we're telling spooky stories. This is not a spooky story. Oh, there's no way on the couch I can
it
say.
depends how you look at it. It is kind of spooky.
I guess so.
Wait, that's it? That's the end of the story?
That is a